Coming up, a wrap-up of Native representation at the Olympics. And after just announcing her re-election campaign, a North Dakota state lawmaker looks back on her first term. Plus, we're catching up with the Cherokee Nation's first delegate to the U.S. House of Representatives. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from the ICT Newscast.
The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is honored to be a supporter of Indian Country Today. ASU offers the only online undergraduate digital media literacy degree, teaching students how to recognize and combat inaccuracies on all platforms. They are using cutting-edge tools and tactics to separate fact from fiction in a digital world overloaded with misinformation. Learn more at cronkite.asu.edu.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Amirawa Hopa. Thank you for joining the ICT Newscast. 10 inches of rain in 3 hours set off dangerous mudslides in the Brazilian city of Petrópolis, killing hundreds. Last week, residents watched in shock as cars and trees were carried down a street by rapidly moving water and mud. As cleanup efforts continue, officials are speaking out.
We saw localized spots of intense destruction. We saw regions that had houses around the erosion, a picture that resembles war. It is unfortunate.
The rain that fell was more than the previous 30 days combined. In fact, the governor of Rio, Claudio Castro, said the rain was the worst Petrópolis had seen since 1932. The state government has confirmed 130 deaths from the floods, and officials are still working to rescue those trapped in the mud. More than a century ago, Serranus Hastings was a rancher and a serial killer of Indigenous people. A study by a law professor in 2017 was an indictment of the murders of hundreds of Indigenous people, including the Round Valley massacres that started in 1856 and continued for 3 years. Since that study, there have been growing calls for the University of California's Hastings College of Law in San Francisco to drop that name. James Ramos, a member of the California Assembly, said there could be a resolution soon.
Definitely working hard around the clock on that issue. So Hastings Law School, the founder of that school, perpetrated militias and killing campaigns against the Indian people in Round Valley and Eden Valley, and particularly the Yuki Indian people. And so now when the school is moving forward to recently accept changing the name, we want to make sure that the voice of the Indian people is being heard in that whole dialogue. And so we are definitely engaged in that. We're making sure that the school takes a little breather to make sure that the voice of the Indian people is part of that discussion around the table. And I've had several meetings now with the law school, with Round Valley Tribal Council, and the Yuki Indian people of the committee that was established there under Round Valley's Tribal Council.
Ramos is the only Indigenous member of the California State Legislature. In Guatemala, a Mayan community is demanding title to its lands. Last week, lawyers on behalf of a Guatemalan indigenous community made arguments before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. An attorney representing the community says he expects a ruling where indigenous people's rights are recognized.
A ruling where, with the participation of indigenous peoples, for the first time, recognizes indigenous peoples as holders of collective rights over their lands and holders of the right to use, enjoy, conserve, and manage the natural resources of those territories.
The community of Agua Caliente, one of 16 Mayan communities, is demanding that the government give them title to their land. They are also seeking compensation and the right to determine how natural resources are being used in their territory.
I need the community's suffering to be recognized and compensated for all the years of suffering we have endured.
The plaintiffs expect court deliberations to take at least 7 months. The popular television network Showtime is donating money to a New York tribal nation whose land it films a show on. Last week, Showtime announced a $100,000 donation to the Seneca Iroquois National Museum. Officials say they made the donation because the entertainment company films its hit series Dexter New Blood on the Seneca Nation. The company says this is its way of giving back. The Seneca Nation says the money will be used to help the museum digitize and archive media. It has video footage, music, and print news that has been passed on from tribal elders that it would like to preserve for future generations. And Dexter New Blood is the most watched series in Showtime history. Who's ready to join the Reservation Dogs family? Last week, a post began appearing across social media inviting people to audition as extras for the award-winning TV series. The announcement says they are looking for all different ages, shapes, and sizes for Season 2. In order to be considered for a background part, there are 2 important steps to complete. You will need to fill out a casting form and have proof of a COVID-19 vaccination. To begin your Hollywood journey, find them on social media by searching for Reservation Dogs Casting. And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. Coming up, a recap of the Olympics, and we visit with the North Dakota state lawmaker. Stay with us. In 2019, Kim Teehee was named the Cherokee Nation's first delegate to the U.S. House of Representatives. This is guaranteed through the Cherokee Nation's 1835 treaty, also known as the Treaty of New Echota. And she joins us now. Welcome, Delegate Teehee.
Thank you so much for having me.
So what's new in terms of you being seated to the U.S. House of Representatives?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me and for asking that question. I appreciate it. Well, where we are is we have intertribal organization resolutions from most of the major organizations in Indian country. We continue to educate leadership staff and committees and members of Congress about this particular treaty right. We've enlisted the assistance of former House parliamentarians to help guide us through a framework that we believe would be historic because the Congress has not, and the House of Representatives certainly has not ever approved or voted on a delegate to Congress before. So we needed to figure out some of the procedural mechanisms and to put a framework together for Congress ultimately to consider. So good, productive conversations. So I'm hopeful.
For our viewers who are learning about this for the first time, tell us exactly what this treaty guarantees and, what a delegate from the Cherokee Nation would do in the U.S. House.
Thank you so much. So the delegate was actually authorized expressly in our removal treaty of 1835, the Treaty of New Echota, and it states expressly that Cherokee Nation shall be entitled actually to a delegate in the U.S. House of Representatives whenever Congress makes provisions for the same. And that is a treaty right that is still valid. It's never been abrogated in the courts or Congress before. And so that's why we're exercising that right now. We have had an earlier treaty right that spoke to a deputy. We had subsequently our last treaty with the United States in 1866 that basically reaffirmed all prior treaty rights. And that treaty itself was reaffirmed in a 2017 federal court case. And in the Cherokee Nation's own tribal constitution in the 2000s gave authority for the principal chief to actually exercise that treaty right and appoint a delegate to be confirmed by the council, which I was unanimously confirmed. And so that's the short, very fast version of what this treaty right does and is.
One of the roles of members of the U.S. House is to stay up to date with current events. What are some of the issues that you're watching right now?
Well, a couple of things. One is, for Indian country, it's not, Cherokee Nation's priorities are not, unlike most other tribes. We are also looking at reauthorizations, the Violence Against Women Act, the Native American Indian Housing Assistance Act. We are also looking at appropriations. We continue to be run by continuing resolutions that are so disruptive of our tribal governments whenever our federal dollars are up in the air. And then obviously addressing the pandemic continues to be a focus of our tribal nation. And then we also have a Native languages bill that we're trying to get through Congress. We know that the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs is putting a omnibus bill together. And so we're working with the committee to try to make sure that that Durban-feeling Native American Languages Act is included among those omnibus kind of bills that'll make its way in. So those are kind of the priorities that we have right now.
How closely do you watch these issues?
Well, I've made a career out of watching them, right? When I worked for the House of Representatives so many years ago and worked in the White House, so much of what I did involved not only my own issues, the Native American portfolio, but also keeping in touch with what's going on in the country and nationally, because our issues cross-cut so many areas. My issues cross-cut so many of my policy colleagues' areas, whether it's education, healthcare, agriculture. So many of those areas get touched upon, and so my job has been to follow what's going on nationally, as well as focusing in on the issues at home for us directly.
You mentioned earlier that you were nominated unanimously to be the delegate for the Cherokee Nation. How long does that stand for in terms of you actually being the delegate? Will that change with the new administration, or what does that look like?
Well, the delegate, I am officially the Cherokee Nation's delegate when I was nominated and then confirmed by the Tribal Council, and my term of office runs concurrently with the current principal chief. So it is a 4-year term.
A 4-year term. And are you hopeful that you'll be able to be seated in the U.S. House of Representatives in this 4-year term?
Absolutely. I'm hopeful we'll get it done this session.
We will continue to follow your journey very closely. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
The Olympic Winter Games in Beijing, China is officially a wrap. The highlight for many was the U.S. versus Canada women's hockey game last week. Miles Morisseau, a Canadian journalist, joins us to talk about the Indigenous representation at the Games. Welcome, Miles. Thanks for being here.
It's good to be here, Aaliyah. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Let's start off with the big hockey game. Tell us about that.
Well, this clash between Team Canada and Team USA in hockey is the premier competition. There is no rivalry in sports quite like it. Since the hockey was introduced in 1998 in Nagano, the Nagano Olympics, it has only been Team Canada or Team USA that has won the gold. That's it. And it's a fierce rivalry. I mean, the competition, the amount of hitting and just the physical, competition. It is really a great matchup between these two premier teams. And so heading into the Olympics, the United States had won 4 years ago, in South Korea. And now, Canada was hoping that they could, win gold this year, but obviously both teams were gunning for gold. And as it turned out, as we were looking at here at ICT, we wanted to see what the Indigenous participation was in the Olympics overall. And it turned out the majority of Indigenous participants we had were in that women's hockey competition. So we had Abby Rock representing Team USA. And on this side of the border, we had Jamie Lee Rattray and Jocelyn Larocque, both of the Métis Nation representing Team Canada. And so, and of course, they do meet in the gold medal matchup at the end of the game. So it was really quite an enjoyable competition. Absolutely.
For the folks who are maybe learning about this for the first time, describe how big of an impact these three players had on both of these teams.
Well, I mean, you start off with Jocelyn Larocque, who is represented Canada at 3 Olympics. She has a gold, she has a silver. She is, one of the more mature players on Team Canada. And so she has been a core player for Team Canada for 3 Olympics now. And then, and defenseman is, she's putting in 26 minutes on the ice. She's always on there working. And then joining her this year, first year for Team Canada, was Jamie Lee Rattray. And Jamie Lee is another good example of somebody who never gave up. She was cut last year. I think she was cut, last Olympics, and she was close to making the team. She made the team this year, age 29. Right. And she played a lot of minutes. She put 10 points up on the board, put her in the top 10 of scoring, which was really great for the first year. And then from the United States, Abby Rock, her first rookie Olympic, and was a dominant player on the ice. When she was on the ice, you knew that she was there, and played a physical game. She ended up scoring 3 goals and got an assist as well. And really contributed to the high level of competition, really represented her nation, her First Nation, and her country as well. So it was really, really wonderful to see.
You mentioned earlier that this matchup is just full of competition. Since Canada defeated Team USA, what has been the response from the Indigenous communities in Canada? Have they been really excited about it?
People are very excited about that. They were very much involved in this game, and I found, looking at sort of the response to the coverage that I was doing, that a lot of people took pride in the fact that it was Indigenous women on both sides. There was that sort of country pride, whatever people may have of that, but there was also that pride of the Indigenous participation. And I think it was really important for our people to see just our people competing at the highest level. And they all have interesting stories. They would have their own personal struggles and whatever they had to do in order to achieve at such a high level. And so it was really, I think people felt a lot of pride, and they should.
I want to switch gears and talk about snowboarding. Tell us about this surprise First Nation snowboarder who got to compete this year.
Well, Liam Gill is 18 years old. He's Dene from the Northwest Territories. And it was the day before the charter was to leave to China. The representative for Canada in halfpipe, and we only had one representative who had able to to make it into the games, but he injured himself on a practice run just before the charter was to leave. And so Liam Gill, this young Dene snowboarder, gets the call and says, "Hey, you're going to the Olympics." And his response was, he didn't have a bag packed. He wasn't prepared at all, but I'm off to the Olympics. And he finished, I believe he was finished 19th. So, but he's out there, he's just a kid. Out there having fun and representing, and who knows what that's going to lead for his future international competitions, having that experience as an 18-year-old at the Beijing Olympics. Something that he can never forget, and likely will feed more success for him in the future and inspire other young people as well.
When Liam got the call, it was such a surprise for so many of us. And I was reporting on that story, and I happened to see that his grandmother was the one who was really excited and cheering him on behind the scenes. You just love to hear stories like that of, relatives who are just cheering on our Indigenous athletes all across the country and Canada, of course.
It's such a high level of success. There's so much work, and they're incredibly talented. They put so much effort into the practice and the training and the diet and all of these things, the sacrifices they make in order to go out there and to be able to participate in the Olympics. That's got to be a dream come true. Obviously to medal like our Indigenous women, where they brought home gold and silver, but still to participate and to be there is got to be a dream come true.
Definitely. Well, Miles, thank you so much.
Oh yeah, thanks again.
In 2018, Ruth Buffalo became the first Native American Democratic woman elected to the North Dakota state legislature. During her first term, the Mandan Hidatsa Arikara Nation citizen helped to pass an Indigenous Education for All bill and continues to advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous people. Welcome back, Representative Buffalo. It's great to have you here.
Yes, Dosha, Madzigidads for having me. Thank you.
So let's start off with this Indigenous Education for All bill. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so when I first got elected into office in 2018 and the term started in 2019, I remember having a conversation with the head of the Department of Instruction, Superintendent Basler, and I'd asked the question about how is it going with teaching Native American history? And at that time, it was at each school district's discretion. And so what we found after waiting and observing was that this was a very necessary next step to ensure that all citizens of North Dakota could benefit from knowing the history of our local Native Americans within North Dakota. So that's sort of how the bill came into existence. But again, it was a very collective effort after visiting with elders and community members. During these challenging times of COVID, we felt it was very necessary to introduce this bill to help all North Dakotans better understand the Native Americans, their neighbors.
This comes at a very interesting time, and I'm sure, as you mentioned, when you were elected in 2018, it's not something that you probably thought was going to happen at the time, but we're talking nationally about having conversations about things like critical race theory, and it sounds like this is going to be something to actually teach, as you mentioned, the true history of what happened in North Dakota. What are some of the highlights of that history that you hope are taught in schools now?
Yes, just the basic information of the geography and the history within the land is so important, even from the early 1950s with the Garrison Dam and the Pick-Sloan Act, flooding 94% of the Mandan Hidatsa and Arikara Nation's agricultural land, to Whitestone Hill Massacre. There's such rich history within our lands that the average Native American does not know. And so we just hope that it will become household names and second nature for all North Dakotans to have a better understanding of these lands that we reside on currently.
What are some of the other pieces of legislation in the North Dakota State Legislature that have come about in this session in particular?
Well, we had a special session in November not too long ago to disperse the ARPA funds. And so I had a bill introduced in my first session. I believe it's House Bill 1313, and it was to establish a missing persons database. And so throughout that process, we found that North Dakota did not have no such database period to track missing people. And so we also wanted to highlight the different demographics, including Native Americans, Indigenous, tribal affiliation. And so this database, as written into law in 2019, provides access across the different jurisdictions. So tribal jurisdictions will have access to the state-based database through the Criminal Justice Information System. However, when it passed into law in 2019, it passed into law without funding. We had a one-time fiscal note at that time of like $49,000 or so. And now fast forward to 3 years later, the dollar amount for the ask to get this database established is $300,000. And so it didn't pass in the last legislative session. And so we were able to get it passed and pushed through and done during the special session. So now that database is now in existence and functioning.
And is that something that you'll continue to advocate for? I know that that's something you've advocated for a very long time, is for justice for missing and murdered relatives. But specifically in this legislative session and the ones coming in the future, is that something that you'll continue to advocate for?
Definitely. It's just trying to tackle the issue within our reach in any way that we can. And so it's definitely a comprehensive approach that is needed. And as a collective, and finding upstream solutions to make sure that we prevent further tragedies from happening. We also introduced 2 different bills focused on human trafficking and prevention for schools and for hotels. And then we also have a missing and murdered Indigenous people law enforcement training. And so again, just trying to tackle this huge problem, longstanding problem within our reach in whichever angle that we can. And so definitely want to focus more on prevention efforts and strengthening our individuals, families, and communities.
Representative Buffalo, we only have a short time left, but I know that you recently announced your bid to be reelected. Tell us very briefly about that.
Yes, I'm running for reelection to hold my seat in the State House of Representatives to represent District 27. Due to redistricting, my district is now more rural. We picked up 2 rural towns, Oxbow and Horace, but I am from a very rural community of Mandaree, so looking forward to connecting with the constituents in the rural areas of the new District 27.
Well, as the midterms come up, I'm sure that we'll watch your race. Thank you so much for being here.
Yes, Madzigidads, thank you.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For more news, visit IndianCountryToday.com. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives. I am Aaliyah Chavez.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.